Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right. Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willies, your host. Thank you so kindly for being with us. Today, we're honored to have Edwin Park. Edwin Park is a researcher, professor at the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy. His work primarily focused on Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, and the Affordable Care Act. And he is considered one of the nation's leading health policy experts on issues related to Medicaid and CHIP financing and the Affordable Care Act's coverage expansions. Among others, he also analyzes tax policies related to healthcare and policies related to drug pricing and private insurance markets. Professor Edwin Park, it's my pleasure to have you on Politics Done Right. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Look, I think the work that you are doing here is extremely important. Specifically, and I know this is research, apolitical research, but in the political realm, it is extremely important. Tell us a little bit about the study that you did relative to Medicaid and rural areas.
Sure. We looked at data from the U.S. Census Bureau and compared coverage rates, Medicaid and CHIP coverage rates in rural areas and small towns to Medicaid coverage rates in metropolitan areas. And while it's not widely understood, particularly among the public, that Medicaid is a vital lifeline for those living in rural areas and small towns. And one of the findings is that for kids and non-elderly adults, these are adults under age 65, Medicaid coverage rates were higher than they were in metropolitan areas nationwide. Seniors, it's a little different. It tends to be the case that Medicaid, which picks up nursing home care, help with Medicare premiums and cost sharing, those coverage rates are higher in metropolitan areas than in rural areas. In 29 states, seniors in rural areas are more likely to have Medicaid than those in metro areas. So clearly demonstrates the vital importance of Medicaid in rural areas and small towns, and particularly for rural hospitals and other providers in these communities. Often they're a single provider in these communities. If a large share of their patients are covered by Medicaid, certainly any change to Medicaid could have a dramatic effect on their ability to keep their doors open and provide the services that their rural communities need.
Now, let's get a few things straight for the audience, because a lot of people don't quite understand. First of all, how is Medicare paid for? Medicaid paid for? In other words, what's the mechanism that we have with Medicaid and how it gets to different communities?
So Medicaid is what's called a federal-state financial partnership. So the federal government pays for a portion of Medicaid costs, and states are responsible for the rest. On average, the federal government picks up roughly 60% or so of the costs of Medicaid, but it depends on the kind of groups covered, the kind of services covered. Those matching rates can vary, and it varies by state as well. But it is the case where the federal government pays for the majority of Medicaid costs and states are responsible for the rest. So if federal funding is changed, reduced, that means states are on the hook for picking up the difference and kicking in more of their own funding than compared to what they do now.
Now, as it stands, if I remember correctly, let's bring a little bit of the Medicaid expansion, the Affordable Care Act into the picture. The Affordable Care Act had a piece called the Medicaid expansion to the Affordable Care Act. How does that compare to someone on basic Medicaid?
So the Medicaid expansion was something that was part of the Affordable Care Act. It covers nearly 21 million people today in 40 states, plus the District of Columbia. Under current law, the federal government picks up 90% of the cost of the expansion. So states are only responsible for 1 in 10 of the cost of the expansion, and it's a vital form of coverage for parents and other non-elderly adults, including some people with disabilities who otherwise weren't eligible for Medicaid. They had incomes too high for Medicaid prior to the Affordable Care Act, but too low for coverage through the new Affordable Care Act marketplaces. And this is, a key factor in terms of why non-elderly adults in rural communities tend to be more likely to have Medicaid. It's because of the Medicaid expansion, in large part because of the fact that adults in rural communities have less access to commercial insurance, other sources of coverage, and so the Medicaid expansion was a lifeline for them, their families, as well as to the rural hospitals that serve them.
Now, and let me see if I can qualify this. Traditional Medicaid is a different program than the Medicaid expansion to the Affordable Care Act. Yes, or is that true? Or
they're all part of the same Medicaid program. So previous to the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid was primarily about covering children, their parents, seniors, and people with disabilities
below a level.
For parents, their incomes, they were generally covered around 60% of the poverty level prior to the Affordable Care Act. The Medicaid expansion provided a coverage option for parents up to 138% of the federal poverty level, as well as non-elderly, non-disabled adults without kids, and that's what is covering nearly 21 million people. But it's all part of the same Medicaid program. It's just a new coverage group that the Affordable Care Act provided, and it was a huge contributor to the improvements in health coverage nationwide since the Affordable Care Act was enacted.
Now, so the proposed cuts that Republicans are considering for Medicaid, does that mean that it'll affect all of Medicaid, meaning both the Medicaid expansion to the Affordable Care Act and those who are just simply on Medicaid?
Yes. So the Medicaid cut proposals that are currently being considered by House Republicans in particular. There was a document leaked last week that included a list of Medicaid cuts. They include a number of different cuts related to Medicaid financing. Many of them reduce federal funding for state Medicaid programs. One proposal would make it harder for states to finance their share of the cost of Medicaid. But they all have the same effect, which is reducing the amount of funding available for Medicaid. And as a result, states will have no choice but to slash their Medicaid programs in response.
Because it's clear that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One of the proposals, for example, would cap federal funding for the entire Medicaid program. So it's not just the Medicaid expansion. And by dramatically reducing federal funding, that means states will be making cuts across the Medicaid program. And so it's not just the expansion. It could be to kids, people with disabilities. It could be seniors in nursing homes. There's a whole host of possible cuts they would have to make, but it'd be across the entire program. One of the proposals is specifically targeted towards the Medicaid expansion, and that would dramatically lower the share of costs picked up by the federal government related to the expansion. That would shift cost to states, and as a result, some states would immediately have to turn off their expansions. Other states would be unable to sustain it over the long run, and as a result, those who gain coverage under the expansion would drop it. But these cuts affect the entire Medicaid program. Kids, their parents, seniors, people with disabilities, other adults, including adults who gain coverage through the expansion, they all would be negatively affected by the kind of draconian cuts that are being considered today.
Now, let me back out of the actual fact-based numbers and just ask you a human question. If they cut Medicare, what are the people who cannot qualify to do? What are they to do?
Oh, so if someone loses their health coverage or their coverage for long-term services and supports, Medicaid, plays such a vital role. It's very likely they will end up uninsured. And we know for a fact that those who are uninsured forego needed care. They have poorer health outcomes. They're more likely to be in a precarious financial state because they have medical debt, unpaid medical bills. And this could have huge negative effects in the short term, but also could have very harmful effects over the long run. Research shows, for example, that Medicaid coverage in childhood leads to better health, less incidence of disability in adulthood, higher educational attainment, finishing high school, going on to college, graduating from college, greater financial stability, higher incomes in adulthood as well. And so the converse is, if you're uninsured, if a child who would otherwise have been covered by Medicaid but is uninsured because of the potential cuts that are being considered, they would have poor life outcomes as a result. So their future outcomes would be worse, and societies would be in a poorer state, a worse state as a result, if Medicaid coverage is lost for kids. So it gives you an example about the effects that will have on people's lives if they don't have the health coverage that they do today because of some of these cuts that are being considered.
As a professor, it is imperative that it is expressed in that way. I understand, but simply put, I'd like to tell our audience here, in effect, what these cuts that are being proposed by the new Republican Congress, in effect, will kill. The professor has just stated how, but these things will kill because people will go without health care and they will die. Professor, rural areas are more dependent on both Medicaid and the Medicaid expansion to the Affordable Care Act. Hospitals around the country have been closing because they are dependent on being funded, given that, as you stated, many people in rural areas are dependent on Medicaid and the Medicaid expansion to the Affordable Care. And thus, if they are not seeking care locally, those hospitals close. Are these things that policymakers, through information provided by professors and studies that you have run, are these things getting, first of all, to the people that need to hear it in Congress? And secondly, how much publicity are we ensuring the average American citizen know about this, given that this is something that directly affects your lives? And if it goes through, it's hell getting it back.
Yeah, I think there unfortunately has not been a public debate about the future of Medicaid and what these kind of cuts would mean for everyday Americans, not just including those in rural areas and small towns. There wasn't any discussion of Medicaid in the campaign in the run-up to the November elections. There have been no public debate about Medicaid cuts since then. And right now, largely behind closed doors. There's discussions of these kind of draconian Medicaid cuts. This was not a factor that was considered by voters, and is largely, passing under the radar. But these cuts would affect the more than 70 million people on the Medicaid program today, including those in rural communities. And, it's very, very critical that people understand the value of Medicaid, all the roles Medicaid plays. It covers more than 60% of nursing home residents, 40% of births, about 40% of kids. It is the primary funder of mental health services in the country, the primary funder of treatment for substance use disorders, including opioid addiction. And as a result, these cuts would have a huge impact across the U.S. healthcare system. And so, there should be a full and open debate about the merits of these Medicaid cuts and their likely effect across, a whole host of Americans, those in rural communities and small towns, kids, seniors, people with disabilities, other adults, that should all be discussed before going ahead with the kind of really massive, damaging cuts that are being proposed that would cause Medicaid programs to be slashed across the country. For example, the cuts being considered total up to $2.3 trillion, according to House Republicans. That's a cut in federal funding of roughly a third over the next 10 years. And it's hard to see how states can compensate for that without having to really gut their Medicaid programs. And that means many fewer people without health coverage, without access to the services they need, including nursing home and other long-term services and supports.
The fact is that states could not recover that money at all. I mean, as it is right now, they're trying to make cuts themselves in healthcare. Now, it seems to me, if we look at the outcomes relative to the OECD, it seems like America shouldn't be cutting Medicaid expansion, but actually increase, or not Medicaid in general, or in the aggregate, it should actually be increasing the amount that it's funded. And we're going in the completely opposite direction, which doubles on the issue. Well, I'm glad that you came on here to point these out. And I usually have one last question that pretty much says the same. What should I have asked you? What do I need to know that I didn't ask you, or that our audience need to know?
Medicaid is important form of coverage for so many Americans, and particularly in rural areas and small towns. And any policy change that could adversely affect that coverage will have a huge negative impact. And I hope that people will raise the value of Medicaid, the importance of Medicaid, so that policymakers think twice before going ahead with the kind of really damaging cuts that are being contemplated that could really take away coverage from tens of millions of low-income kids, seniors, people with disabilities, and other adults, including their parents.
Professor Edwin Park, research professor at the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy. Your work is very important. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right. This is something that America needs to hear.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today, we're honored to have Walt Rowen. Walt Rowen is a small business owner. He's the Small Business of America Future co-chair and president of the Susquehanna Glass Company in Columbia, Pennsylvania. Like many small businesses, he is currently feeling the pain of Trump's tariffs. While a lot of his materials are made in the U.S., a lot of supplies are imported from other countries like China and Mexico. Good day, Mr. Rowen. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm fine. Thank you for asking.
Well, let me first ask you, tell me a little bit about your particular business, because I think what many Americans need to understand is we no longer live in that kind of a country, or anybody live in any country that's insular. that is the past. Tell us a little bit about your company, your production model, etc.
Well, actually, we're very interesting. We are a third generation. So it was my grandfather and his older brother, but it was started in 1910. And it was basically a decorating or a design and decorating company in the domestic glass industry here in the United States. The glass industry was making household products, wine glasses, barware, tumblers, vases. Our company designed the product, had the molds made, and then placed the molds with the factories that produced the glass, mostly in West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania. They made the glass for us, shipped it back to us in Eastern Pennsylvania, and then we turned around and sold it through a series of sales reps and trade shows to retail stores around the country, which ultimately went to the consumer. So we were in the domestic handmade glass industry for the bulk of the early years of the company's history. So from, say, 1915 all the way up to about 1950, we were doing that. The domestic glass, handmade glass industry essentially collapsed starting in the 1960s and probably finished completely by the 1980s or 1990s. Part of that was just simply, it was an older industry. It wasn't maintaining its, bringing in new people. It wasn't creative. But also it collapsed because of the opening of the European factories that were behind the Iron Curtain in the 1970s. So Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania were closed to the U.S. market pre 1960, 1970. When they opened up, most of the big department stores that were buying products domestically were able to go overseas and started to buy from those factories. They came out of a communist system, so they had no sense of what costing and profitability was compared to U.S. factories. And so what would have cost $2 from a domestic factory, you could buy it for 25 cents. So that was sort of a good example of how industries and globalization can ruin or tear apart an industrial base here in this country. But I want to also say that part of that was self-induced. The factories were having a hard time getting workers. They weren't keeping up. The owners weren't putting money back into the industry. So there's a huge number of reasons why this process happens. It's not just simply that we were being taken advantage of, which is the sort of the thought today from the administration. That's just not true.
That was never really true, right?
It was never true. No.
People, businesses, the reality is every business uses the concept of the efficient allocation of resources. And in so doing, the efficient allocation of resources in the case of an industry where a lot of Americans didn't want to work in a factory that had a lot of heat to make your product as I've imagined, and other places had people who wanted to build that. The allocation of resources moved it that way. That isn't to say there aren't reasons for tariffs. There are reasons, but that isn't one of them. Now, how is the current tariff model affecting your business in particular? And then we can expand that a bit further.
So let me take the history or the story a little bit further. What we did as a factory, because we have a 30,000 square foot factory here in Pennsylvania. We've employed, right now I've got about 40 full-time employees. We've had upwards of 120 employees at different times. We also tend to be very seasonal. So because we sell a consumer product, a Christmas season, fourth quarter is very busy for us. That's always been the case. So we've had lots of issues with manufacturing. We are representative of we're not making the raw product, but we're decorating the product. We're adding value to it. Today, what we did, instead of becoming an importer, like a lot of the other companies that were doing what we did in the domestic industry previously, we decided to stay as a manufacturer, as a decorator. So today we decorate a lot of other products in addition to glassware, although glass is still probably about 60% of what we do. We're decorating with a hand decorating process. We're doing color screening. We're using new technology with lasers and sandblasting equipment. So we're doing a variety of different decorating processes on glass, ceramics, metal products. So it's a broad range of processes and products. Most of the glass that we use, we are still able to buy domestically. It's not the handmade glass industry any longer. It's the machine-made glass domestic industry. So when you can have major technologies and efficiencies, you can still produce well in the United States. So you don't lose all of your industries. And the machine-made glass industry in the United States is a good example of it. It's still fairly healthy.
Now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just finish. We cannot find domestic ceramic coffee mugs. We cannot find domestic metal travel tumblers, the double-walled, heat-resistant travel tumblers. So we're buying those from importers or buying them from overseas. We also buy high-end glass from countries like Italy and Germany. So we buy a lot domestically, but we also source from importers and buying from other countries as well. So with tariffs, it right now is a completely frozen situation. Best example is China has something like 150% tariff. I'm not even sure what it is right now.
145.
145. So we buy through an importer. We buy a lot of ceramic coffee mugs. Important part of our business. Coffee mugs cost us through the importer, let's say $2. They range from $2 to $3, whatever. But at $2, and tariffs were probably somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. So at $2, 10%, that's
30 cents. Yeah, 20 cents to 30 cents. Yeah.
Duty rate, which is the other term for tariffs. That's what duties have been on those kinds of products. All of a sudden, the importer who's got containers coming of coffee mugs that he's ordered from the factories in China 6 months ago, they're coming in constantly. And when they hit the ports right now, the tariff is now, instead of 10%, it's 145% on top of probably the 10% tariff. Mm-hmm. So if you take an item and if I'm buying it at $1, say $2, now suddenly that same item is instantly going to become $5.
$5.50.
Cost to me.
Yeah.
Cost to me. The importer doesn't have a lot of margins. He's not going to absorb the 145% extra cost. So he's going to pass it on to me. I'm going to decorate that product. And instead of it being a $12 or $15 decorated coffee mug, it's now going to be a $25 or $30 decorated coffee mug. So absolutely, no question, no economist will argue the fact that tariffs are passed through to the ultimate consumer. You raise tariffs on products, and even in our case, it's a part of a finished product that we produce. It will, without a doubt, increase the cost of the product to the consumer substantially if you have raised tariffs at that 145% rate. And even the 20, 30% rate that theoretically is going to be applied, it all is going to instantly increase products to the consumer, period. That's a fact. There's no other alternative answer to that.
I am glad the way that you articulated it from the point of view of that one product or family of products that you sell. But I want to expand that a bit more for the audience, because for the audience who believe they don't have the empathy for the American business person who's importing all this stuff,
I want them to realize several things that you've said in your narrative. One, a lot of the materials that you built over here in the past that is now done in let's say overseas, when it comes in here, there's a magic thing that you do with it. You added value to this thing that came to here. And adding value means having workers, they're no longer blowing the molding or blowing the glass that you did, but you have a new skill set that more Americans are willing to do in America. So the idea, go ahead.
And in a sense, it's developed. It's the future.
It's evolved.
It's not bad. It's good.
Right. It has evolved. And that is what good business is about. I mean, there is bad business, but good business is that type of where there is a symbiotic relationship between what's done locally and what's done externally. Yes. What the president has done is he has simply used an axe, a chainsaw, in the way he has implemented policies that now doesn't only harm good businesses and bad businesses alike, but the American people. Now, much of this, Walt, is really a backdoor way to raise taxes on you, the average business, and the American citizen. My question to you: you are soon to be the leader of small business for America's future. If you are not already the chair, are you the chair already, or?
Well, we call ourselves co-chairs. There's 3 or 4 of us that are in our own businesses in some way or another. And we are supporting the organization, which essentially is trying to represent what we call Main Street small business of America. The U.S. government defines small business as any business under 500 employees.
Right.
Us, 200 to 500 is a mid-sized company. That's right. Big. And it's not that we are excluding anybody, but we want to speak for that small entrepreneur. It might be your hairdresser. It might be the baker down the street. It might be, the restaurateur. So what we do is we send out a lot of surveys trying to capture information about what is going on in the heads of the small business folks in America. And most of the time people say, well, are you bipartisan? Not what? And most of our surveys, when we get them back, we break down into 3s. A third of the people responding are Republican leading, a third are Democratic leading, and a third are independent. So we really believe that we're capturing the mainstream voice for non-corporate business America.
Well, I think what you just said is very important, but I also think that you are the heart of America. Small business of your size represent most people in America. You mentioned the hairdresser, the barber, the restaurant owner, all these folks. There is a fallacy that all businesses like you are looking for is to squeeze the employee and to just make it for yourself. And in such a light, always go for a type of policy that harms. I listened to your story and I've heard, and I'm trying to pull out a whole lot of these stories of what true good American businesses are doing. I'm not talking about the parasites. I'm talking about the good American businesses that are trying to make a buck and at the same time trying to give a good living to other people. My issue many a times, Walt, is that your voice isn't heard loud enough. The voices that are generally heard are the ones that are not doing what you are doing, are not there to add value, but are there to use what's brought into this country as just what eliminates those that are here. I wanted to distinctly point out in your business model, you add value, you employ, you make lives better for others. How do we get your voice and other businesses doing that type of work into the fold? And how do you make your presence known much better?
Yeah. So I appreciate what you're saying. I'm going to agree with most of what you're saying. I use the term non-corporate small business compared to corporate big business. What I also want to say and make clear is that each of those categories are not innately good or bad.
True.
Corporate America is not bad. Small business America is not always good.
True.
There are differences between them, but there's also enormous similarities. The one similarity is that in America, business is a capitalistic structure, and all of the owners, the people that own the businesses, ultimately need to make money, have a profit in order to continue to do what they're doing. So, corporate America has a much more complex ownership structure and also management structure. So, corporate America often is across many, many different communities. So one of the really differences between corporate and small business America is that small businesses are almost always in one community. They're embedded in Columbia, Pennsylvania. I've been here as a business for 115 years. A lot of my people walk to work. I know the kids of my employees. So my business decisions and my core values as a small business are just naturally more connected to my community. So my decision, I'm going to take my factory and move it to China because I could do that and theoretically decorate glass cheaper in China, is way more complex for me because there's so many values that I'm going to rip apart if I do that. And I'm just not going to do that. Number one, I more than likely don't have the resources to do that. Corporate America does. Small business doesn't. So we're not thinking about that. But even if we thought about it, I don't think we'd do it because we're just connected differently. It doesn't mean that corporate America is disconnected from people and disconnected from their communities, but they are far more likely to make decisions that don't absolutely come out of what's best for the community. They have to make decisions about what's best for their investors, their total. And that's not bad necessarily. But if you go back to the models that we're talking about, why did big department stores decide to go over to Europe to buy product over there? Well, because they could make more money, but also they could give the ultimate consumer a better product. So there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in there. But being rooted and connected to the community also makes us, I believe, more willing to understand the values of the society and how we collectively need to work together. And our government is part of that society, and government isn't always the bad guy. In many cases, government can really bring services and value to our community that the individual entrepreneurs, the business community can't. So something as simple as I employ a lot of people. One of the biggest barriers to having people come into work for me is they have kids. Childcare is a huge issue in America today. If the United States as a government would take on childcare as an extension of education, we accept the idea that in American society, once your kid is in school, you as a parent are freed up from having to take care of your kid because the school does that. And they're doing lots of stuff. And most of our education is government-based schools. That's historically been a huge asset to the United States. If we would add childcare, that would be incredible.
And, and to interrupt a bit, first of all, let me just tell you, I love all that you had to say. I differ with you slightly on the benevolency of corporations and why I think regulations are so important for corporations, because what you do in your community and the love that you show for community and the responsibility that you show for your workers it's because it's inherent to you. It's not capitalism. It's inherent to you as a good free enterprise type business person. If we want that society for all, in my humble opinion, that in the corporate sector, where I agree with you that it has a different model with shareholders, etc., your benevolence has to be somehow regulated on the corporate level. You don't have to agree with that, but that's my thought. Secondly, when you talk about the one thing your employees would do well by is having institute somewhat, as we find in some of our more our countries like Denmark and other, more support for our kids. And likewise, I imagine every single year that you have to renew healthcare for your employees, it's a headache. How am I best going to give them a good value? That is something else that shouldn't be under your control. You make glass. You may be the best glass maker in Pennsylvania.
Decorate glass.
Decorate glass. Yes. Decorate glass. Well, you used to make it, but you decorate it now. And that is great. That is what you excel at. You don't excel at finding healthcare for your workers. That's another domain. That's so right. I like where you're going, but this conversation kind of veered off a bit. This is on tariffs. And I appreciate you illustrating exactly how tariffs affect your business, your particular business, but that just as it affects your business, it affects every single business in America, because we are no longer is any business can say, I'm here in my studio. Most of this stuff wasn't made here, and I'm a red-blooded, proud to be American person, but I still need this equipment. Please give me a closer, Walt.
I can't overemphasize how drastic this sudden change in American trade policy is to not just small business, to the U.S. economy, but to the world economy. And because it was done in a very snap way, instantaneously, it is so disruptive and will just devastate whole industries if it's not dialed back down and managed in a way that is far more thoughtful and just simply, it's based on principles that aren't true.
Walt, your words and the words of many other sensible business people, once heard by the appropriate forces, I think will make a difference. I think this is going to be temporary pain, but I think it's going to make a difference. We've been speaking to Walt Rowen, Small Business for America's Future co-chair and president of the Susquehanna Glass Company in Columbia, Pennsylvania. Thank you so kindly for having spoken to Politics Done Right.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Today, we're honored to have attorney Paul Kiesel. Paul Kiesel is Speak Up for Justice founder and a national recognized trial attorney based in Los Angeles, whose practice focuses on personal injury, class action, environmental, and taxes tort litigation. He has been named one of California's 100 most influential attorneys by the Daily Journal, one of the top 50 trial lawyers by the Los Angeles Business Journal, and among the top 500 lawyers in the United States by Law Dragon. Welcome to Politics Done Right, Senor Paul Kiesel. How are you doing today?
You know what? I'm honored to join you this afternoon and have this conversation. I'm glad that you cut that introduction just a little bit short. It can take a long time for that, so thank you.
Well, you're a renowned kind of a guy with a very long history, but what I did is I chopped what I got from the top. And I think being named the top of all those things is great. But look, let's sort of get busy. I want to start with the Supreme Court. I mean, we're going to talk about the issues with California in a minute, but I want to start with the Supreme Court. Recently, the Supreme Court has given the president, being a law neophyte, what seems to me to be a blanket check to do as he pleases while in office with the immunity decision that they made. Do I have that right, or are there some limitations to it?
Well, look, there's certainly going to be limitations to it. I think that the Supreme Court, in part rightly, acknowledged that the commander-in-chief and the elected leader of this country has a fair amount of discretion in terms of what he or she does in that position. Is it unfettered? Is it without limitation? Absolutely not. Have we hit that moment in time yet? I'm not sure. Perhaps when we talk about California and what the president did to our National Guard, he may have hit the wall in terms of what authority he has to issue executive orders, or in fact, orders from the president's office that get executed on. I think the Supreme Court, to be clear, has given the president a lot of flexibility, but it's not without limits, in my view.
Now, this country is over 200 and odd years in existence, and something of this sort has never come up. Why? What makes this administration so novel that it needed something of this sort?
Well, I don't think that it's the novelty of this administration that gives them the immunity that the Supreme Court suggests the president of the United States has, regardless of the party that president is coming from. What's unique about this particular president is he is stretching his authority and pushing this country in a way no other president in our nation's history has ever done. Look, Speak Up for Justice, which is the organization I put together, is just to do this. We as a community, as citizens, need to recognize that the law is our best guardrail in this nation for its democracy. And when the law becomes flexible, when presidents are free to ignore decisions of courts, this nation as a democracy is really very fragile and extremely at great risk of collapse as a democracy when the rule of law ends. And Speak Up for Justice, to go on for just a bit, judges can't speak for themselves. When Judge Boasberg issues his decision and Trump calls for his impeachment, and members of Congress ask to impeach a federal judge because they don't like his decision, that's not how business is done in this country. There's appellate courts. There's a process you go through. Just because you don't like a judge's decision, you don't remove that judge from office, or worse, threaten the life of that judge.
We used to believe that a government made up of three independent but co-equal governmental bodies, if you will, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive, protected us from that sort of what I call tyranny. But it seems to me like maybe we have erred in believing that there's some protection there, and just maybe it's not.
Well, here's the thing. There's never been a time that I'm aware of, certainly not in my 65 years of life, where a sitting president has ignored the decision of a court. We're a nation where historically the president may not have agreed with the decision that was reached. The community, the public might not have agreed with the decision that was reached by the Supreme Court, but we followed the rule of law anyway. We're at a flex point right now where if in fact the decision is to ignore what the court has done. We use the word, it's a constitutional crisis. Mm-hmm. Really, it's a deconstruction of democracy when that third branch of government is ignored and you have a legislative branch that appears to be unwilling to stand up for itself and assert what its rights are.
You know, I used to tell my audience a long time ago, again, like I said, I'm no law scholar, but I sure know how to read the Constitution. And I once told my audience that the way I see it is that the judiciary is the most powerful segment of the three branches, simply because they could deem anything unconstitutional. The one thing I had never believed would have happened is that we would have had a legislative branch that ceded just about all of its power to executive, and at that point makes the court seem almost impotent. Your thoughts?
Well, here's the point. If in fact the legislative branch chooses to disregard its responsibility to be a check and balance, to be a guardrail. If the legislative branch falls aside, the only protection we have is on the cliff side of the roadway. If you go off that side, you're dead. So the guardrail that we have right now is just on the side of the cliff. And if they go through that guardrail, which is the court system, there's not much hope for us.
What I tell people is that ultimately it is now we, the people, and we have to make the we, the people of the Constitution stand for what it really stands for, we, the people.
I couldn't agree with you more. That in fact, that's really the impetus behind stand, or I should say, speak up for justice, because it's the community, it's the lawyers in part, but it's all of us. I know there's going to be a No Kings rally this weekend to see how many thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people that come out to show their support for our democracy by saying no kings in this country. That's not what we signed up for.
All right, let's get into California now. California, the president, I think it's really two issues. One, having taken away the power from the governor to go ahead and empower the militarize or empower the guard, the National Guard, but most importantly, to commission 700 Marines, active Marines, to go into LA. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are pretty simple. Number one, obviously, Judge Breyer, who is the younger brother of Stephen Breyer, Supreme Court justice who just retired. You couldn't hope for a better judicial officer. He's got 23 years of experience. He's brilliant. And to be clear, whatever his decision is, we're going to abide by. If he says the president has the authority, someone can appeal it and it'll go up the chain to see what happens, but we'll accept it. I hope and pray that if his decision is, you know what, the president did not have authority under Title 10, Section 12406 to do this, that the administration will say, okay, if the order is to pull back the Marines and to stand down with the National Guard, I only hope and pray our executive branch acknowledges that decision. They can appeal it, but that in the meantime, they do what the court instructs them to do, which is your point. A federal judge, if you ask me what the most powerful position is in America, I always said it was to be a district court federal judge, because one single federal judge can declare something unconstitutional, and that is blanket across the United States until it goes to a higher court. That can happen quickly. But the fact is, a single federal judge, one side or the other, makes a decision, and that is the rule of the land right now. That is an important, powerful position to have.
Now, the question is, though, would he stay the order if he went ahead and made the decision?
Great question. I think if he wanted to avoid a constitutional crisis, which would happen if he said, I want you to immediately withdraw the troops today, give that order, that he could do that. But he could also say, you know what, I'm going to grant the injunction. I'm going to order that the troops be returned, but I'm going to stay my order for 14 days to give you a chance to go to the Ninth Circuit and hear what the Ninth Circuit has to say. That would be a very cautious way to approach it. It wouldn't really get the military off the streets at the moment, but it would be a cautious way to approach it.
But there are times when that cautious approach causes damage, right? Because while we're waiting for that decision, these guys are on the road. These guys are active. I mean, there are reasons for judges to stay something. I mean, you stay something if not staying it wouldn't create massive problems in doing so. And what we are saying is that if this isn't stayed immediately, these people could harm quite a few of our American citizens.
For example, Abrego Garcia.
Exactly.
Before his plane left the ground, the judge issued an order: do not deport this individual, and yet they ignored that and sent him to El Salvador. Okay, that would be a time for an injunction to issue immediately and no stay. Just get it ordered and stop it. Okay, I agree with you. And there's certainly an immediate concern about having the military on the streets of Los Angeles, where you don't need them. We have a pretty effective police force. We have the sheriff's department. We have agreements with forces all around Southern California that can help where our own force can't do it. We have enough authority on the streets that we do not need the military present in our streets. So I do think he could issue the injunction and require it to happen immediately, and it would scale back the protests that are happening in this city right now.
As Andrew Jackson said, the Supreme Court can say as it please, but make me follow the rules. Isn't there an error in the Constitution or a problem with the Constitution when it doesn't give more power to everybody else? In other words, if the judge tells that says that the president is doing something wrong and he refuses to have to complete that order, shouldn't there really be yet another and some other part that says, okay, we're going to arrest the president for not following an order?
These are issues, as you started our conversation, we've never confronted before as a nation, right? We run the risk of being a dictatorship.
Right.
If we look, the program I'm going to be doing on June 26th for Speak Up for Justice, I'm going to have a remarkable group of federal judges, one from Venezuela, where the law fell apart. The constitutional system in Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez was elected, disappeared. And so I'm having a federal judge who's living in the United States under asylum because this system fell apart in Venezuela. I'm going to have a judge from Poland, federal judge who's a sitting judge in Poland. Poland came very close in the year 2020 from losing its legal system when they took over. I'm going to have a judge from South Africa talking about these issues of international rules of law and how the United States has been a leading light, a lighthouse that other nations have followed. We lose that opportunity if we move away from the rule of law we've had for nearly 250 years.
Paul, look, I want to thank you, but first of all, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everybody, and that is, please tell me what you would have liked me to ask that I didn't ask, and give us a closer that you'd like to close with.
Funny, when I'm trying a lawsuit and I've got a witness on the witness stand, or a juror, I'm looking to choose a juror for a trial, I always say, what you just asked me, what didn't I ask you that you should tell me that I should know? And I would say this. The fact that you've got folks engaged here is so critical. Every single one of your viewers, of your listeners, need to be involved because this has to be an American effort. American people need to stand up. This is a democracy. It only works if we get engaged. Speak Up for Justice is about being engaged in the process. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for all the people that are engaged in this Constitution for us.
Paul Kiesel, founder of Speak Up for Justice, among many other things he's known for. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right.